My brother called me at 2 in the morning and said 4 words that saved my business, my house, and probably the next 10 years of my life. He said, "Don't sign those papers." And then he said, "Please, Marcus, whatever they told you, just don't sign them tomorrow." And then he hung up. I called him back 11 times before I stopped counting. Nothing. I texted. Nothing. For 3 days, the 3 longest days I've had since my father died. My brother's phone rang and went to voicemail, and the deal of my professional life was sitting on my desk waiting for my signature, and the only person on earth who knew why I shouldn't sign it had gone completely silent. I want to tell you what it's like to be in that position, because it's the thing nobody prepares you for. You have a warning you can't verify, from a source you can't reach, about something you've spent 8 months working toward. Every hour that passes without Danny picking up is an hour where the warning could mean anything. He could be right. He could be wrong. He could have been dreaming. And the closing is on the clock. You're standing in front of a deal that looked clean for 8 months, holding 4 words and a dead phone, and you have to decide whether that's enough to walk away. And the answer is, you don't know. You can never know at that moment. You just have to decide what kind of man you are when you don't know. By the end of the 3rd day, I knew why he'd called. And I understood, for the first time, exactly what those 4 words had cost him to say. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 51 years old. I run a commercial flooring company. We do large-scale installations. Office buildings, hospitals, schools, the kind of square footage that makes a residential contractor's eyes water. I started it in my father's garage at 24 with a used truck and a commercial tile saw I bought on credit, and 27 years later, I have 43 employees, a fleet of 6 vehicles, and a reputation in this part of Georgia that it took most of my adult life to build. It's not glamorous work. Flooring is what nobody thinks about until it's wrong. Nobody walks into a hospital and says, "Wow, beautiful flooring." They just walk on it and it holds them. But it's real, and it's mine, and every square foot of it I earned the slow way. One contract, one crew, one very long day at a time. My brother Danny is 2 years older. He's a loan officer at a regional bank, has been for 20 years, and he is the most methodical, cautious human being I have ever met. Danny does not call at 2 in the morning. Danny does not say 4 dramatic words and hang up. Danny sends emails with numbered bullet points and PDF attachments. He's the man who proofreads birthday cards before he signs them. I mean that literally. I have watched him hold a birthday card under a lamp to check the spelling. The call itself, even before I understood the content of it, should have told me everything I needed to know about how serious it was. Because Danny doesn't do dramatic. Danny doesn't do impulsive. In 20 years of banking and 49 years of being my brother, the most alarmed I'd ever seen him was when he used 2 exclamation points in a text. Once, he apologized for it the next day. 4 words at 2 in the morning. From a man who proofreads birthday cards. Before I tell you what was in those papers, do me one small kindness. If you've ever had someone try to warn you about something they couldn't fully explain, and you had to decide whether to trust the warning or dismiss it, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the right person. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you something that I still argue about with myself, and I want your honest call. Let me tell you about the deal, because you need to understand what was on that desk. About 8 months before the call, I'd been approached by a man named Carter Blythe. Carter was the representative of a private investment group called Meridian Capital Partners, a name so respectable sounding that I should have been more suspicious of it. And he came to me with what looked like a gift. The pitch was clean and specific. Meridian wanted to take a 49% silent stake in Webb Commercial Flooring. They would inject $300,000 of growth capital immediately, with another $200,000 available as a line of credit. No operational interference, no seat on any board. Silent. Just capital in exchange for the stake, with a buyout clause if either party wanted out. I need you to understand why this was appealing, because it was genuinely appealing, and being clear about that is part of being honest with you. For 27 years, I'd bootstrapped every dollar of this company. Every truck I bought, I'd saved for. Every piece of equipment, the same. Good years I reinvested. Bad years I tightened. I'd grown the company the way you grow something when you have no safety net. Slowly, carefully, never outrunning your cash. And I've been profitable for 15 of those years, which meant I'd also been capacity limited for 15 of those years. I had more work than I could take. I was turning down hospital contracts, good contracts, the kind that build a reputation, because I didn't have the crews to deliver them. $300,000 would change that overnight. 6 more crews, 2 more vehicles, the ability to say yes to the contracts I'd been saying no to for a decade. Carter Blythe was the kind of salesman who knew when not to oversell. He'd spent exactly the right amount of time explaining what I'd use the capital for, and then he'd gone quiet and let me do the rest of the math myself. He had references. He had a clean presentation. He had a legal agreement that my own attorney had reviewed and found standard. He had a name, Meridian Capital Partners, that sounded like a thing that had existed for decades and had an office with plants in it. Every signal I could see said legitimate, which is the whole point of a well-built surface. You can't see the rot from the top. And Carter Blythe was smooth. That's the word. He had answers for everything, delivered in a calm, informed voice, and the references checked out. The attorneys I hired gave the agreement a clean read. Everything looked fine. The papers were on my desk, signed by Carter and countersigned by Meridian's principals, waiting for my signature. The closing was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning, 2 in the morning. For words, if you're still with me, do me that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what I found in those 3 days. Because the silence was the most important part, and I almost filled it the wrong way. At 8 the morning after the call, I was supposed to be at my attorney's office at 10 to close. I sat in my truck in my own driveway at 8 o'clock with my phone in my hand, having called Danny 6 more times since I'd woken up, and I made the only decision I could trust. I didn't go. I called my attorney and told him I needed 48 hours. He was baffled and not thrilled, but he bought it. I told Carter Blythe I had a family situation and needed to push the signing 2 days. He was gracious, understanding, even which in hindsight was itself a tell. A legitimate investor doesn't love a delay, but they absorb one calmly. Carter absorbed mine with a smoothness that should have made me uncomfortable. It didn't yet. I was still too focused on the fact that my brother had called at 2 in the morning and gone completely silent. That first day, without Danny, was the worst. I knew nothing. I told my attorney and Carter that I had a family situation, and I did. I just didn't know what it was. My brother might have been crazy. He might have mixed me up with something else. He might have been drunk, though Danny hasn't had a drink in 15 years. I sat in my office with $300,000 on the line and 4 words of explanation and an unreachable phone, and I tried to figure out how to think clearly about it. The thing I kept coming back to was this. In 49 years, Danny had never once called me at 2 in the morning. Not when our father died. Not when he went through his divorce. Not when his youngest was in a car accident senior year of high school. Not once. If that man was calling me at 2 in the morning, it was because he didn't have a better option. And if Danny, methodical, careful, proofreader birthday card Danny, was out of better options, then something real was happening. I didn't sign, and I started reading. The papers were right there on my desk. Every word of them. 27 years of signing contracts before I do any job, material contracts, subcontractor agreements, payment terms, had given me a way of reading that isn't the same as what a lawyer does. A lawyer reads for legality. They ask, can this be enforced? I read for logic. I ask, does the story this tells about what both parties want actually make sense? Is the deal this document describes the real deal, or is it the polished surface of a different deal underneath? I've been laying floors long enough to know one truth that never changes. What you can see is almost never the whole story. I've pulled up perfectly beautiful tile and found rot underneath that would have taken the whole building if we hadn't caught it. I've walked across floors that looked and sounded solid and felt a hollow spot under my foot that told me something was wrong before I could see a single piece of evidence. You develop an instinct for the thing under the thing. You learn to ask what's underneath before you commit your weight to what's on top. So I read the papers with that instinct running, and I started finding the hollow spots. The buyout clause was the first thing. My attorney had flagged it as standard, and it was standard language, but the trigger was set in a way I hadn't fully absorbed the first time through. If web commercial flooring failed to hit certain growth benchmarks in the first 18 months, Meridian had the right to initiate a forced buyout of my 51%. The price for that buyout was fixed in the agreement, not at market value, not at any independent valuation, at a formula set 8 months ago when the company was smaller. In the 8 months of due diligence and negotiation since we'd grown, the formula was now a significant discount to what the company was actually worth. If Meridian triggered the buyout today, they would buy my controlling share for roughly 60 cents on the dollar. I sat with that for a long time. It was uncomfortable, but not necessarily sinister. Plenty of buyout clauses use fixed formulas, and maybe my attorney had just not flagged the implication. But the next thing I found was harder to explain away. The growth benchmarks. I went back to them knowing now what a triggered buyout would cost me. They weren't aggressive, achievable levels for a growing company, but they assumed no disruption. No loss of a major contract, no significant equipment failure, no unusual labor costs, no market dip. They were achievable in a smooth 18 months. And real business doesn't give you smooth. I pulled my record for the last 5 years. In 5 years, I had hit disruptions, significant ones, in 4 of them. A truck breakdown that cost me a hospital contract. A material supplier who went under and cost me 6 weeks of delays. A bid war that killed a deal I'd counted on. You don't make it 27 years in this business by having smooth sailing. You make it by surviving the rough patches. But if you set a benchmark that requires no rough patch and hand a 49% stakeholder the right to force a buyout when the first rough patch arrives, you've built a machine to take a business from someone at a discount on a delay. You've made the investment look like growth capital when it's actually an option to acquire. By my 3rd cup of coffee at 2 in the afternoon of the second day with no Danny, I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't investment. This was a purchase, a slow one, structured to look like a partnership. Meridian wasn't putting in $300,000 because they believed in my growth. They were putting in $300,000 as a premium to get the option to buy a $1 million company for $600,000, triggered by the first bad quarter. I sat with the papers, and I thought about Carter Blythe's smooth voice and his clean references. I picked up the phone, and I called the references myself, not through Carter, but directly tracking down the owners of the 2 companies he'd cited. I found them through business records, the same way I'd find any contractor. The first one didn't call back. The second one did. He picked up on the second ring, and when I told him why I was calling, that I'd been offered capital by Meridian and was in due diligence, there was a pause. A long one. And then he said, "Let me tell you what happened to me." He told me that his company had taken Meridian capital 3 years ago. The first year had been great. The growth was real. The money was real. Carter Blythe was professional and unintrusive and everything he'd promised to be. And then in month 16, his company had hit a bad quarter. A major client had canceled a contract unexpectedly, not because of anything his company did wrong, just a client's internal decision. It was a disruption, a normal business disruption, the kind that every real company faces at least once every few years. And Meridian had immediately notified him that the growth benchmarks hadn't been met and that they were initiating the forced buyout at the formula price. He'd had attorneys look at it. He'd tried to negotiate. He'd argued that the benchmark miss was caused by an external cancellation beyond his control. None of it mattered. The contract was airtight, the trigger was clear, and the formula was the formula. He'd lost controlling interest in a business he'd spent 12 years building, for 62 cents on the dollar. He'd paid a lawyer $30,000 to tell him he had no case. And then he said the thing that made the room very still. They changed their name, he said. Meridian Capital Partners. Before that, they were something else. And before that, something else. By the time I found out what they really were and started warning people, they were operating under a third name in a different state. They move. They leave, and they take the thing they came for, and they move. He paused. "Have you signed anything yet?" I said no. He said don't. Danny worked in commercial lending. He reviewed business acquisition deals. He read financing structures for a living. He had seen, I now understood, something about Meridian, a name, a structure, a pattern that had made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And he'd call me at 2 in the morning because he didn't know how else to get through to me in time. For words, and then silence. Silence for 3 days. I want to tell you what those 3 days were like because they're the part of the story I think about the most. I was sitting on information that I couldn't prove and couldn't explain, a pattern I'd found, a warning I couldn't verify, a reference whose account might have been wrong or exaggerated. For all I knew, Danny had gotten spooked by a superficial resemblance and hung up at 2 in the morning the way people sometimes do when they've had a fear and can't explain it cleanly. He was unreachable. I couldn't confirm, and the closing window was counting down. I went back and forth 100 times. I'd spent 8 months on this deal. I'd had attorneys review the contract. I'd done due diligence. If Danny's pattern recognition was wrong, if Meridian was a legitimate investor who just had the bad luck of a name similarity, then I was about to walk away from $300,000 of growth capital based on a sleepless phone call and one embittered former reference. Every reasonable part of my brain kept making that argument. And then I'd look at the papers, and I'd feel the hollow spot, and I'd stay put. On the morning of the 3rd day, still no answer from Danny, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a nurse at a hospital 2 hours away. Danny had been in a car accident on the morning after his call to me, the very morning I was supposed to sign. A bad one, on a wet road. He'd broken his arm, 3 ribs, and had a concussion serious enough that they'd kept him sedated for the first 2 days. His phone had gone dead. He hadn't been able to reach anyone. He'd given them my number as soon as he was alert enough to remember it. He hadn't been silenced. He hadn't been threatened. He'd just been in a hospital bed, unable to move, while the thing he tried to warn me about sat on my desk and the clock counted down. I drove those 2 hours the same morning. 2 hours in the truck I've driven to job sites for 20 years, listening to the radio and then turning it off because I didn't want noise, trying to figure out what shape Danny would be in and what I'd say when I walked in, trying to decide, still, whether what I'd found in 3 days of reading was as bad as it looked or whether I'd talked myself into a catastrophe that didn't exist. But here's the thing about reading floors. Once you felt the hollow spot, you can't unfeel it. The knowledge lives in your foot, not your head, and it stays there. I felt the hollow spot in those papers, and everything I'd found in 3 days had only confirmed it. Danny was in room 314. He looked like he'd fallen down a flight of stairs. Arm in a cast, ribs wrapped, face still swollen from the airbag. He was awake, and when I walked in, he looked at me, and the first thing he said, not "Are you okay?" not "How's the arm?" not anything you'd expect, was, "Did you sign?" I said no. He put his head back on the pillow and closed his eyes, and he let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for 3 days, which in a way he had. He told me what he knew. A week before the call, a financing application had come through his bank from Meridian Capital Partners, a different filing, unrelated to my deal, but with overlapping principles. Danny reviews these structures the way I read contracts, and he'd recognized the playbook immediately. He'd seen it once before, years ago, in a loan application from a company that later turned out to be running a systematic acquisition scheme. They'd used it on 5 businesses before they were shut down. The structure was distinctive. The fixed formula buyout, the benchmark triggers, the 18-month window. Like a fingerprint, he said. You see it once, and you know it when you see it again. He'd flagged the application and gone home. And then he'd lain awake. And somewhere around midnight, he'd open his laptop and search the name of one of Meridian's principals. And he'd found it. Connected, through 2 degrees of separation, to the investment firm I'd mentioned to him 8 months earlier when I'd first been approached. He'd sat at his kitchen table at 1 a.m, his wife asleep down the hall, trying to decide whether to call me, whether he was being paranoid, whether he had enough to justify it. And then he'd check the clock, and it was 1:45 in the morning, and my signing was at 10, and he'd picked up the phone. I knew if I explained it, he said, you'd ask me questions, and I'd give you answers. And by the end of the conversation, you'd have decided you needed more information, and you'd have called me back after you'd slept on it. And by then it would have been 9:30, and you'd have gone to sign because you hadn't found a reason not to. I didn't have proof. I had a pattern and a name and 8 hours. So I gave you the only thing that would actually stop you without giving you room to argue. I looked at him lying there in that bed. My careful, methodical, birthday card proofreading brother who'd called me at 2 a.m. and said 4 words and hung up. And then you got in a car accident, I said. He almost laughed, which looked like it hurt. And then I got in a car accident on a wet road at 6:30 in the morning on my way to work because I hadn't slept. Nothing dramatic, just a wet road and a truck that stopped faster than I expected. He paused. Was the deal still open when you found me? I told him yes. It had still been technically open. The closing had been pushed twice, and Carter Blythe was starting to get impatient, but the deal was still on the table. Danny closed his eyes. And if I hadn't called, I would have signed a 10, I said. And I'd have had a bad quarter within 18 months, because everyone does. And then they'd have triggered the buyout. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a thing he was afraid of is confirmed. I told him about the reference. About the man who'd lost his controlling interest for 62 cents on the dollar. About the 7 companies over 11 years. About the name changes. About Carter Blythe's smooth voice absorbing my delay with a patience that made sense now. They'd absorbed plenty of delays before, and they always got what they came for eventually, because the contract was always airtight by the time someone signed it. Danny listened to all of it with his eyes closed, and when I was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, I'm sorry I couldn't call you back. I'm sorry I left you hanging. You saved the company, I said. You saved the company, he said. All I did was give you a reason. Let me tell you what I did, because the ending matters. I didn't sign. I notified Carter Blythe that I was withdrawing from the deal, citing concerns about the agreement's terms. Politely, without accusation, just a clean withdrawal by email. Carter was this time not smooth. He called twice and pushed back harder than a legitimate investor would push back about a politely declined deal. That pushback and the messages he left went into the file Danny's compliance officer was building. I don't know yet where the investigation lands. These things take years, but I know they're looking. And I know that Carter Blythe and Meridian Capital Partners have not, as of the last I've heard, found their 7th company. I found my growth capital another way. A competitor I'd known for 20 years, a man named Bill who ran a flooring company 2 counties over and was looking to retire in 5 years, heard I was looking for a partner and called me the old-fashioned way. Lunch, a handshake. Terms worked out over 2 meetings, papers drafted by lawyers who answered to both of us. We know each other. We've worked adjacent jobs. We've lent each other equipment. It's a smaller deal. Bill's capital isn't what Meridian's was, and the growth will be slower. But the structure is clean all the way down to the concrete. No buyout triggers that can be pulled by someone else's hands. No formula written when my company was worth less. Just 2 men who've been in the same trade for 25 years, shaking hands on a deal they both understand. That's the floor, and it'll hold. Danny got out of the hospital after 9 days. He came back to work, and a month later he drove down and we had dinner at my house, just the 2 of us, the way we used when we were younger and neither of us had much. I made the same thing our mother used to make when she wanted to feed us without making a fuss about it. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd spent 3 days reading contracts. And at the end of the night, over coffee, I asked him the thing I needed to understand. I asked him, why 4 words and hang up? Why not stay on the phone and explain it? He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he said, because I know you, Marcus. If I'd explained, you would have asked me questions, and I would have given you answers. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation, you'd have decided you needed more information before you could act. You'd have wanted to look into it yourself before you called the signing off. You'd have been reasonable because you're a reasonable man. And I didn't need you to be reasonable at 2 in the morning. I needed you to not sign those papers for 8 hours. Just 8 hours. Long enough for the doubt to sit with you overnight. He looked up. 4 words, and hang up gives you no room to argue with me. If I stay on the phone and explain, you start asking questions and I start answering, and by the end, you've processed it instead of just heard it. I'd rather you spend the morning thinking your brother might be losing his mind than thinking your brother made a pretty good point and signing anyway. He was right. If he'd said, I've seen a pattern in a financing structure that might resemble your deal, and I have some concerns, I'd have said, okay, let's talk it through when you know more. And I'd have gone to bed and signed a 10. He knew that. He stripped it down to the exact 4 words that would stop me without giving me room to negotiate. Because my room to negotiate is what would have killed me. My little brother, The man who proofreads birthday cards saved 27 years of my life with the 4 most dramatic words he's ever said, and then got in a car accident on the way home, and spent 3 days in a hospital bed while I tried to figure out whether he was crazy or right. He was right, and I was lucky. And those two things are different because they don't always arrive together, and I've been on enough job sites to know you can't count on the two coinciding again. Next time the warning comes, I hope I remember that the warning itself is the thing, not the explanation, not the evidence, the person, the fact that this person who never does this is doing this. That's all you need. I've been laying floors for 27 years, and I'll leave you with the one truth this business has taught me over and over that I should have trusted the moment I read those papers. The thing that holds everything up is always underneath. It's in the subfloor, in the concrete, in the joists you can't see. People walk into beautiful buildings and they see the finish, the grain, the shine, the surface that cost the most and took the least time to put down. They don't see the subfloor. They don't ask about the concrete. They don't wonder what's underneath the part that photographs well. The truth about any structure, any building, any deal, any person lives under the part they show you. Your job is to find a reason to look down before you put your weight on it. Meridian Capital Partners was a beautiful finish. Smooth presentation, clean references, polished language. An attorney who said the contract was standard. Everything you could see was fine. And in the structure, in the place you only reach if you read past the surface and ask the question nobody told you to ask, was a machine built to take everything I'd spent 27 years pressing into that invisible subfloor. My brother called me at 2 a.m. He said 4 words, and he hung up. He drove to work on a wet road the next morning and hit the brakes on ice and ended up in a hospital bed for 9 days, unable to call me back, holding the warning he'd given while I either listened to it or I didn't. He couldn't give me more than 4 words. And it turned out 4 words was exactly enough because he knew the right 4 words, and he knew me, and he knew that 4 words from him at 2 a.m. would weigh more than any explanation he could have given. He didn't give me evidence. He gave me himself. And 27 years of knowing that Danny doesn't call at 2 a.m. was worth more than anything I could have found in the contract, because it told me the truth before the truth was visible. He says I saved the company. I say he saved the company. The answer is probably both. What I know for certain is this. The people in your life who never cry wolf are the ones you cannot afford to ignore when they howl. One call. For words. Trust it. So here's my question, and I mean it because I still go back and forth. Danny had no proof when he called. Just a pattern, a name, and a feeling. If I hadn't found the reference, if the papers had turned out to be clean, I would have walked away from $300,000 based on 4 words and a gut feeling that wasn't even mine. Was I right to not sign based on that alone? Or does a man owe it to his own life's work to demand actual evidence before he walks away from real money? Tell me how you'd have called it in the comments. I made the right call in the end, but I had to make it before I knew that. If this story meant something to you, do me that kindness, subscribe, hit like, and this week pay attention to the people in your life who never cry wolf. When those people make the call, answer it. Answer it before you know why. I'll see you next time. A note before you go. This story is a work of fiction written and dramatized for entertainment. The names, characters, and events are invented, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But if its lesson stayed with you, that the people who love us quietly are often the ones who see the most clearly, and that sometimes the most important evidence you can have is someone you trust saying 4 words, then it did its job. Trust the people who never cry wolf. We'll see you in the next one.